What if I told you the secret to happiness isn't hidden in some self-help book, but is literally hardwired into your DNA? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a truly intriguing framework for human happiness created by João Holland de Barcellos, who's also known as Jocax. We're going to dive into a philosophy that attempts to bridge the massive gap between our ancient biology and our very modern lives. It's a completely fascinating lens through which to view human behavior, our sense of purpose, and ultimately how we find joy.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 5 stops. First, the biology versus culture conflict. Second, the foundations of Genism. Third, the paradox of genetic altruism. Fourth, ethics, science, and memes. And finally, happiness in the here and now. Let's get right into it.
Part 1, the biology versus culture conflict. Before we can even talk about happiness, we have to look at the exact opposite. Why do we suffer so much? Seriously, I want you to think about that for a second. To fix a problem, you gotta diagnose it first, right? Well, Genism diagnoses our unhappiness by pointing to a really profound mismatch in our everyday existence.
It basically boils down to this clash. On one hand, we've got our biological instincts. These are baked right into us from conception. They're immutable, unchangeable desires. On the other hand, we have our cultural values, religions, daily habits, societal customs. And unlike our biology, culture is incredibly flexible. It changes all the time. So the big takeaway here is that human suffering actually stems from this intense friction. When our ever-shifting cultural rules fight against our fixed biological programming, we suffer. It's like trying to run new software on totally incompatible hardware.
All right, moving on to part 2, the foundations of Genism. So, if cultural friction is the illness, what's the cure? This brings us to genitalism itself. Formalized in the late 1990s, the creator was heavily inspired by Richard Dawkins' famous idea that organisms are basically just survival machines. Genitologism flips the usual script. Instead of forcing our biology to conform to culture, it proposes that we need to align our culture with our biological imperative, which is, simply put, genetic perpetuation. The idea is that when we stop fighting what we're biologically wired to do, we get rid of that painful friction and, theoretically, maximize our potential for happiness. This framework also totally rethinks something humans have obsessed over forever: immortality. Traditional immortality usually leans on spiritual concepts, like the belief in an immaterial soul. But genus immortality offers a completely physical, factual alternative. Because our genes are real, tangible things passed down from generation to generation, keeping them going is a literal, physical form of living on. It grounds the idea of immortality purely in physical reality, no mysticism required.
And that leads us to this incredibly provocative evolution in the philosophy from around 2003. We are our genes. Let that sink in for a minute. Under this framework, your consciousness, the part of you listening to me right now, isn't actually the core of who you are. Instead, consciousness is seen as just an appendix. It's an evolutionary tool built to help your genes survive. The real you, the true essence navigating this universe, is just your genetic code.
Which brings us to Section 3, the paradox of genetic altruism. Now, I know exactly what you're probably thinking. If I'm just a survival machine driven by my genes, doesn't that make humans inherently selfish and cold? It's a totally fair critique. But let's look at the numbers, because the data completely flips that selfish assumption upside down. You see, our genetic material isn't operating in a vacuum. We share about 86% of our genes with our direct descendants, but get this, we share a massive 68% with any other random person of the human species. Your genes are literally scattered all across humanity. You are biologically connected to the people around you.
And here is where the paradox kicks in. Because our genes are so widely shared, Genism argues that true, genuine altruism actually comes from this biological connection. The deep drive to protect your own genes creates profound, selfless behavior towards others. Think about a mother risking her life to save her child. She's acting on a primal biological imperative to protect her shared genetic code. So ironically, the so-called selfishness of the gene is exactly what builds the beautiful selflessness we see in humans.
Part 4, ethics, science, and memes.
Okay, so we've got this biological drive, but how does it actually play out in society? How do genes control a complex human being? They use what are called mechanisms of induction. It's kind of like an evolutionary ladder. At the very bottom, you have simple, rigid automatic actions, like a plant turning toward the sun. Move up and you get primitive instincts, like breathing. Keep going, and you hit desires and reward systems, feeling pain when you touch a hot stove. But at the very top of this ladder, that's where we find epigenetic rules and the absorption of memes. Our genes actually built our massive neocortex so we could store cultural knowledge, memes, to help us survive and adapt even better. But there is a catch with having these highly advanced brains. We can accidentally absorb what this philosophy calls mimetic viruses. Since Genism is strictly rooted in atheism and the scientific method, it argues that beliefs totally disconnected from factual reality, things like mysticism or religion, are actually alienating and dangerous. It views these non-factual memes as software bugs. They distort our reality, create contradictions, and ultimately cause human unhappiness.
So without traditional moral structures, how do we figure out what's right and wrong? Genism uses something called scientific meta-ethics, or SME. And it's pretty straightforward, just two main steps. Step 1, your individual happiness is limited by the happiness of the group. Step 2, the total happiness of the group always trumps your individual happiness. Basically, you can't just selfishly chase your own goals if it hurts the people around you. An action is only ethical if it doesn't drag down the overall well-being of the community. It's essentially a biologically grounded golden rule.
Finally, Section 5, Happiness in the Here and Now.
We've covered a ton of ground, but how does all this theoretical biology actually help you on a Tuesday? Well, human reason is an amazing thing, but sometimes it backfires. We invent these cultural memes, like the pressure of endless consumerism, or rules like strict celibacy, that directly contradict our biological programming. When we follow those harmful cultural scripts instead of our natural drive to thrive and perpetuate, we literally manufacture our own distress. The philosophy asks us to identify and strip away that harmful cultural noise.
In the end, you can think of Genism as a sort of protective earthly vaccine. It anchors your search for joy completely in the present physical reality. It explicitly tosses out the idea of waiting around for some post-mortem paradise. By accepting that this life right here on Earth is the only one we definitely have, it lights a fire under us. It creates this fierce urgency to build justice, debug those mimetic viruses, and maximize our happiness right here, right now.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive question. Are your choices being guided by your biological essence or just by cultural memes? Seriously, the next time you have to make a big life decision, take a step back. Ask yourself, is this what I genuinely want as part of my shared humanity, or is this just a cultural script somebody handed to me? It's a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.